What if The Shining had ended in fire instead of ice? Well, like the book, it originally did, as Jack Torrance would have gone down fighting, sacrificing himself as the Overlook Hotel's boiler exploded. Dick Hallorann also would have survived and become the hero of the movie, saving Wendy and Danny. Additionally, Kubrick had filmed an entirely different ending, which he'd forced projectionists across the country to physically cut out of the film print and mail back to the studio a week after the film's release. To find out what happened behind the scenes to arrive at one of the scariest films in cinema history, let's take a look at what could have been The Shining. After Barry Lyndon flopped at the box office, Kubrick felt he needed to rebound with a hit. Horror was booming, with The Exorcist and The Omen proving audiences couldn't resist supernatural terror. Kubrick himself wasn't drawn to ghosts or gore, but he was pragmatic. If he wanted to win audiences back, horror was the way to do it. Kubrick approached the search for the right story with his trademark precision. His secretary later recalled hearing the heavy thud of books hitting the wall in his office as he tossed aside one horror novel after another. Then, one day, the sound stopped. She peeked in to find Kubrick completely absorbed, turning the pages of a single book with unshakable focus. That book was Stephen King's The Shining. However, a few years earlier, King had already drafted a screenplay that closely followed his original story. Jack Torrance was a sympathetic man trying to rebuild his life, haunted by addiction and anger, but ultimately capable of redemption. The Overlook Hotel, haunted by literal ghosts, preyed on his weaknesses and slowly corrupted him. In King's climax, the Overlook Hotel's malevolent presence fully possesses Jack, but he manages to briefly regain his humanity. He tells Denny to run, resists the hotel's influence long enough to sabotage its plans, and goes down with the building as the faulty boiler explodes. His last act is an attempt at redemption, saving his family at the cost of his own life. Wendy is strong and resourceful here too, protecting Danny at every turn. And Dick Hallorann, the cook with The Shining, not only survives, but is the hero of the story, saving Danny and Wendy, helping them escape, and even going on to help raise Danny and become a mentor to him afterwards. King's draft preserved both the scares and the heart, but Kubrick rejected it almost immediately. Redemption and moral acts didn't interest him. He wanted ambiguity and an atmosphere where audiences could never be sure if the hotel was truly haunted or if Jack was unraveling under isolation. To achieve that, he brought in novelist Diane Johnson, and together they reshaped the story. Gone was the exploding boiler and Jack's final act of sacrifice. Instead of surviving, Hallorann was killed almost immediately upon entering the hotel, while Wendy shifted from being strong and proactive to fragile and terrified, embodying dread rather than resilience. And rather than fiery catharsis, the story ended in icy stasis, Jack freezing to death in the hedge maze, followed by a cryptic photograph implying he had always belonged to the Overlook. To King, these changes stripped the story of its humanity. He frequently described Kubrick's version as cold and soulless, a work of technical brilliance but emotional emptiness. What he had written was a story about love, sacrifice, and redemption, which Kubrick hollowed out into a bleak puzzle of ambiguity. Their divide became one of the most famous author-director feuds in film history, with King often voicing his disdain even decades later. However, by straying from King's novel, Kubrick ensured that even readers who thought they knew the story would be caught off guard. Killing Hallorann the moment he arrives doesn't just raise the stakes, it shatters expectations. Audiences who assumed his survival would guide Wendy and Danny suddenly realize no safety net is coming. With their one lifeline gone, the hotel feels inescapable, and viewers are left gripping their seats, desperate to know how mother and son could possibly survive on their own. With the script in place, the next challenge was bringing these characters to life, and here too, Kubrick's decision sparked debate that continues to this day. Casting Jack Torrance was crucial, and Kubrick's first choice was always Jack Nicholson, whose manic energy had already defined films like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Nicholson could project warmth one moment and menace the next, which Kubrick saw as perfect for the character. The only real backup was Chris Christopherson. If Nicholson had passed, Kubrick would have turned to him, bringing a quieter, stoic masculinity to the role. Stephen King hated the casting of Nicholson. He believed the character should start as an ordinary man who gradually unravels. Casting Nicholson, he argued, meant audiences would expect madness from him instantly, robbing the story of its surprise and of Jack's tragic descent. King preferred someone like Jon Voight or Martin Sheen, actors whose breakdowns would surprise viewers. Years later, Steven Spielberg echoed King's concern, saying Nicholson seemed too crazy too soon. Kubrick, however, wanted to lean into that quality. For him, Nicholson's volatility fit perfectly with his vision of Jack as brittle from the beginning. Rather than corruption, Kubrick presented revelation. Jack wasn't broken by the Overlook, he was exposed by it. If Nicholson set the tone, Wendy provided the counterbalance. In King's novel, Wendy is strong and resourceful, hospital, capable of defending her son. Nicholson even suggested Jessica Lange for the role, whose commanding presence would have matched that vision. However, Kubrick wanted Shelley Duvall, because he wanted someone in that part that maybe the audience would also like to kill a little bit, feeling the actress was both attractive and irritating when she spoke. However, it wasn't an easy sell, as the studio wasn't enthusiastic about Duvall, instead pushing for a bankable star like Jane Fonda. After she was cast, Duvall was pushed harder than almost anyone in film history. The baseball bat scene was allegedly shot 127 times, leaving her drained and fragile. Kubrick even isolated her from the crew, berated her in front of others, and gave contradictory directions to keep her unsteady. The stress was real, as her hair began falling out during the shoot, but the performance he drew out of her was raw and unforgettable. Despite the grueling experience, Duvall herself looked back on it with a kind of admiration. She admitted the shoot was almost unbearable at times, but also acknowledged that Kubrick's methods were intentional and effective. She even said she enjoyed working with him and would have done so again. The casting of Hallorann added its own twist. In King's book, he survives, helping Danny cope after the ordeal. Kubrick approached Slim Pickens for the role, but the actor refused, scarred from Kubrick's relentless take counts on Dr. Strangelove, where they previously worked together. He told Kubrick he'd only do it if his scenes could be limited to fewer than 100 takes, but Kubrick declined. The part then went to Scatman Crothers, whose warmth and humanity made Hallorann instantly sympathetic, which is why his death in the film lands so brutally. However, when Crothers signed on, he was told he would be the hero of the film, but Kubrick changed the ending during production, eventually killing him off. Kubrick's revisions didn't stop at the script. Even after filming, he continued cutting material that might have reshaped how audiences understood the story. One such moment took place in the ballroom. Jack discovered objects arranged into arrows, heard a ghostly voice, and then watched as a ball was tossed back to him. The scene would have shown the hotel acting directly, guiding him deeper under its influence. Kubrick removed it, believing it tipped the scales too far toward the supernatural. But the most fascinating cut was the hospital epilogue. After the shot of Jack frozen in the maze, the film originally shifted to Ullman moving down a stark white hallway in an absurdly oversized brown fur coat, clutching a bunch of dark, ugly roses. First, he finds Danny playing with a nurse at her station, and then proceeds into Wendy's room, where she's in bed recovering. He tells Wendy the police went over the overlook with a fine-tooth comb and found nothing unusual or supernatural. Everything she saw, he insists, was perfectly understandable for someone under such stress, but nothing was real, suggesting she hallucinated it. He even tries to smooth things over by inviting her and Danny to stay at his beach house in LA until they recover. On his way out, he passes Danny playing with toys, stops, and casually tosses him the yellow ball from the hotel. A small but chilling sign he may have known more than he let on. The film then would have cut to the slow tracking shot of the photographs. For about a week after the release of the film, audiences actually saw this ending. Then Kubrick abruptly changed his mind, possibly after seeing audiences laugh at Ullman, suggesting Wendy hallucinated the whole thing. In a move that's become part of film legend, Kubrick instructed projectionists across the United States to physically cut the ending out of their film reels, splice the prints back together, and mail the removed footage back to Warner Brothers. Interestingly, there were even darker directions considered. Diane Johnson, Kubrick's co-writer, once suggested that Danny should die at the end, an idea she felt would heighten the tragedy. Kubrick vetoed it. For him, Danny was the one beacon of hope in the story, the child who escapes the labyrinth where his father is forever trapped. The film's most famous line, Jack Nicholson's crazed cry of "Here's Johnny," wasn't in the script at all. Nicholson improvised it as he hacked through the bathroom door, riffing on Ed McMahon's iconic introduction of Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show. For American audiences, the reference was instantly recognizable, but Kubrick, who had moved permanently to London in the 60s and never flew again, shooting all of his later films in England, didn't get the reference. Unaware of its significance, he nearly chose a different take, until it was explained to him and persuaded to leave it in the film. Danny Lloyd later recalled having a great time riding his big wheel around the massive overlook sets, since the crew kept letting him circle the halls while they debated how to capture the shot. A dolly wasn't possible because of the tracks, so Kubrick turned to a brand new invention, the Steadicam. Operated by its creator, Garrett Brown, it allowed the camera to float just inches from the ground, giving Danny's ride a ghostly, disembodied quality that made the audience feel as though the hotel itself were watching him. As they filmed, something unexpected happened. The sound of Danny's plastic wheel shifting from muffled silence on carpets to sharp clattering on hardwood created an eerie rhythm. The overlook itself seemed alive, breathing through sound. However, Kubrick didn't initially like it, and it took fellow filmmaker Werner Herzog, who was visiting the set, to convince him that it sounded good. The Steadicam rig was also so heavy that Brown was exhausted after only 3 takes, so he improvised by mounting the Steadicam on a wheelchair to be able to endure Kubrick's endless takes. The result was one of the film's most haunting sequences, as those Steadicam shots transformed the hotel into a stalking predator. Kubrick's obsession with control touched every corner of The Shining's production. Danny Lloyd, the child actor playing Danny Torrance, wasn't told he was in a horror film. Kubrick shielded him, framing scenes as if they were part of a family drama. Lloyd wouldn't see the film until years later, when he finally realized realize what he had been a part of. Before filming even began, Kubrick used scale models of the sets to test out camera angles and lighting. It was part of his obsessive preparation, and eerily mirrored the hedge maze miniature that appeared later in the film. Even cast anecdotes reflect Kubrick's relentlessness. Slim Pickens' refusal to work with Kubrick again revealed how notorious the director's methods had become, while Scatman Crothers endured them, once breaking down in tears after a day of repeated takes. For Kubrick, perfection wasn't negotiable. It was part of his process. When The Shining premiered in 1980, it wasn't well received. Critics called it slow, cold, and overwrought, and it became the only one of Kubrick's last 9 films to receive no Oscar or Golden Globe nominations. Instead, it earned Razzie nods for Worst Director and Worst Actress. But over the years, its reputation transformed. The things that once turned audiences off, its ambiguity, its coldness, its unnerving performances, are the same things that have kept it alive for decades. What was once dismissed as a misfire is now seen as one of the greatest horror films ever made, endlessly analyzed, imitated, and now completely reappraised. Thanks for watching, everybody, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more of Hollywood's untold stories and unmade movies.